Hello and welcome to this gameplay podcast episode. It's week 20 and I have with me a significant gameplay guest, actually, who we haven't had on in a while. But first of all, regular on this podcast, of course, we have JoshXLS. Hello.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, far less significant, obviously. But I have now joined the haves group in terms of a Team of the Year item. I packed Team of the Year 𝘂𝑪 from one of the 77x3 upgrade packs. So what a time to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, do Team of the Year icons definitely count as blues? I mean, they're kind of white and blue, but...
I'm taking it. I definitely didn't have a moment where I missed the fact that it was an icon and thought I'd packed 𝘵𝘃𝗍𝘳. That definitely didn't happen. But once I realised it was an icon, it was kind of win-win, 5.5 million coin player or the king. So, you know, one or the other.
Yeah. Have you used them yet?
I have not. No. I had to immediately go and do some shopping. So, I've got that to look forward to.
Nice. Well, that is good to hear. And we can move on to, as I mentioned, our gameplay expert on this podcast. It is NealGuides. Hello, welcome back.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for having me on. I think it's been some time as well.
Yeah, it has. But it's good to have you, especially because I know people are doing a lot of learning at the moment, particularly around defending. Before we do that, though, we should probably talk a bit about what we've seen swirling around online, talk of there being some kind of shadow patch or that the big patch, the gameplay refresh, was reverted. I mean, I think, Josh, just to start off with, we can rule out the fact that the patch might have been reverted completely, right? We'll just say that at the start.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are so many different factors within the game that would show that the patch hasn't been reverted. I mean, if you still think we're playing the same game that we were playing before the patch, I don't really know what you played beforehand, because it definitely wasn't this. You know, I do think that there's been a lot of changes to the way that the game is being played, but I don't think that it's necessarily evidence of a shadow patch. Definitely not a revert. I mean, we downloaded, a 5 gigabyte, 4.5 gigabyte patch for this new gameplay. And, you know, I mean, just go and look at the Pro Open last night. There was like twice as many goals scored than there was pre-patch. So it's definitely still there.
Yeah, and I guess we should ask you, this shadow patch, as people are calling it, I mean, I think for me at least, and I've noticed this because I looked at the connection quality report that you can find that EA do, and you can find detailed breakdowns of your matches and the sort of, I guess, ping, packet loss and all that stuff. And I did notice that the packet loss did seem to be a bit higher over this last weekend particularly than I'm typically used to. So I wonder whether what people are actually experiencing is perhaps some worse connection as a result of presumably quite overloaded servers for Team of the Year.
Yeah, it's interesting. To be honest, I think everyone is going to find the difference in gameplay. I think it does feel different, and I can imagine people think there's been some shadow patch. But I think it's a combination of two things. I think obviously when the patch came out, it was a big change for a lot of people who didn't know how to defend. And over that period of time, people have learned to defend, learned to become better. So that way, the way people defend, the style that they play, those things have changed. And I think the connection as well. So I think when you put them both together, it's a recipe for affecting the gameplay quite a lot. And as I said previously, if you compare the game pre-patch and post-patch, it's night and day. But don't get me wrong, it does feel bad. I think it's more to do with the connection here. And I would say more people are adapting to the game and understanding, okay, this is how I was getting maybe beaten a few weeks ago, maybe thanks to my videos and other people's videos, and then they've just made the adjustments.
Yeah. And actually, in terms of that connection element, again, we did have some downtime on Sunday. Champs got extended. I don't know if it was anything to do with that, the reason why maybe there's been some connection issues, but I know one clip you shared, Josh, I think really did highlight the potential for this to be connection related, because it was something that I don't think you would have even seen before the patch necessarily.
Yeah, no, I played a through ball in to my striker who then, with their legs still pumping, was kind of just stuck in place. Like, it was like the input wasn't there. And in fact, someone pointed out that the if you looked at the stamina bar, you could see the stamina bar had stopped decreasing. It was almost as if I wasn't pressing sprint, but my sprint was depressed the entire time. So it was if there was some connection loss in that moment, and that then caused my player to essentially just stop running, and for visually it to look absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, we've all experienced heavy gameplay, and I just feel like because it's come so close to this patch being dropped, that's the expectation is that, oh, they must have changed the patch back, rather than it necessarily being like, oh, this is just heavy gameplay that we get every time that there's a lot of traffic through the servers. I don't think it's a surprise that this happened on and around Thursday. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, around full team release for Team of the Year. Suddenly, servers got a bit heavy and gameplay wasn't as fun anymore. So, I think there's a lot of factors that are going into it. I think there's an element of like skill recalibration. A lot of people, like myself included, I wasn't really enjoying the game, so I was keeping myself in a lower division so that I could just have easy rival games, just get my stuff done that I need to get done. Like, I didn't really try hard in champs too much. It was not overly enjoyable, and so you might ask, why am I still playing it? Well, I still enjoy like the whole game as a whole, but that was like my way of playing. Once the new patch came, like Division 4, it was like rage quit after rage quit after rage quit after about 12 minutes, because you were already like 4-0 up, because no one could defend. All their tactics were wrong. People are so heavily reliant on the AI. Now I'm in Division 1 at the moment. I've not played Rivals this week, but the people who are in Division 1 now are going to be better than the people I was playing even in Division 2 when I went through Division 2, because you can get relegated down to Division 3 in those top 3 divisions. So I just think there's an element of skill recalibration that's happened, and people had much easier games when the patch was released and now are having harder games. That must mean the patch has changed. People have changed their tactics, their setups, the way they're defending. Teams have completely changed because we've had Team of the Year, so people are adding in Team of the Year players in. We're getting more Role++, so the Role++ massively affects the way AI controls your team. So if you think defensive AI has got better, could it be that it's because the players have got better stats and have got Role++, so are being helped a lot more? I just think there's when you then add in heavy gameplay, I just think that there's so many more reasonable explanations than EA reverting what was probably the most well-received patch we've ever had, especially coming off the back of the fact that they had just announced to their investors that they would go not making as much money as they were before. And one of the major reasons they put that down to was bad gameplay. They literally said it in their report to investors that they've just released a massive gameplay update and it's been received really well. Like, why would they revert it? Like, logically, it makes no sense. And some people will argue, or maybe they just don't know. Maybe there's been an issue on a server side, potentially. EA aren't shadow patching the game, though. They're not pushing something out because there is no logical reason for them to do so. That's like, and I absolutely have felt the gameplay be different. I just think it's heavy, and I think that's more server related than any sort of nefarious activities.
Yeah, and I think actually we should maybe move into talking about the gameplay adjustments people have made, I suppose. And Neil, you pointed out that people will be consuming content around this and implementing the things they've seen in content. That could be your guides and tutorials on your YouTube. What do you think has been the sort of main thing that people have done that sort of made a difference post-patch? Is there any particular thing you'd sort of, I guess, also suggest to listeners perhaps they try?
So I think there's a few things. I think, first of all, people are waking up a bit more to the pace on defenders. To be honest, even when the game came out, I was still using 85 sprint speed at the lowest. And I feel like the first thing people did is they made the adjustments to pace, because when strikers are running in behind, and I think maybe a bit too often now. I think now even when you sometimes select your defender and try to run back, you sometimes can't make it. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing was, I think before you could literally defend by just running around with your CDM. You could literally do nothing and let the AI defend for you. But the wing and the wider areas, when the patch came out, people were just doing what they were used to, running around with their CDMs, and they weren't necessarily being somewhat, I'm not gonna say they're being overly passive, but I would say maybe they weren't diligent in what they were doing with their players. And I think as time went on, the biggest adjustment people made is they start defending a bit more carefully. they weren't just running out. So I feel like now if you run out, you're going to get destroyed with a through ball in behind. So I'm actually seeing it less. I have like an account in every division. I always do this to test things out, see what's going on in the game, how people in Division 7 are playing. And I've noticed a lot that people are not running out as much, even in lower divisions, which is normally a common mistake. So I think people have been adjusting, making those changes and being proactive. I think also one thing I've noticed is I think there's a bigger skill gap in player switching. People are now switching earlier, trying to get that, because I think now the faster you can react and the quicker you can switch, that's going to be another skill gap in defending, one of the biggest skill gaps I would say after this patch.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. I haven't seen, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, Josh, people complain about player switching that much this cycle compared to normally. And I guess that is because the speed of the game wasn't that high, so you weren't having to player switch that quickly. Whereas now I feel like I've seen those complaints resurface, people saying, oh, player switching has, gone to pot over the last couple of weeks. And I think that probably is why. And it shows that you do need to be more active in your defending. And that's not necessarily being really aggressive, but it's just making sure that you're continuously, I guess, moving through your defenders to make sure the positioning is correct and to make sure you're covering the options your opponent has.
Yeah, and like just on the player switching point, we actually have more options now in the game than we ever have done before to change how our player switching works. And I do think there was maybe some complaints about player switching right back at the beginning of the game, but people found their like happy medium, got used to whatever the setting is that they use in terms of their switch sensitivity, whether like what relative switching they did, whether it was ball relative or player relative. And I think now the positions in which you're switching player has to change. And so people are now switching player, as you say, at a different time. And so now your sensitivity, it's going to be a little bit different because you maybe are trying to switch further than you used to before. Maybe now you're trying to switch from an attacking midfielder back to a centre back or to a wing back to mark a run that you've seen. So I think there's now a lot of different aspects to player switching, and the fact that you now have to player switch more often. We were talking in the Discord a few days after the patch release. It was like, you have to be switched on for the whole game. Like, this is not one where you can just sit back and like passively play for 10 or 15 minutes. You have to be switched on, because if you don't spot that run, it's so easy to play that pass and the player's just away. You have no catch-up speed anymore. So I think that's definitely playing a part to it. I also, as Neil rightly pointed out, there are now decisions to be made defensively. I feel like you could have got away with marking passing lanes pre-patch, and it was a pretty good way to passively defend because your AI marked up really well all of the runners. Now, you could also be aggressive. You could also go and try and press. I mean, that tackle from behind was so effective. Like, tackle in general was so effective. Your tackle box, as it were, like the area in which you could win a ball, was massive. Now I feel like you have to make the decision between marking a passing lane or going and pressing. And if you get that decision wrong, you are going to be punished. Again, we saw it last night in the pro event. The number of times someone would press badly with a centre-back and the ball would just go over their heads and, Ronaldo, it usually was up top, would just run through and score. There is now a real skill to defending, and that is a skill that people are slowly going to have to learn. They're going to learn coping mechanisms, which happened, I think, initially, and now they're learning the skills that are required for it. And again, the cream will rise to the top, right? The best players at learning that new defensive style will be the ones that start getting into those higher spots in the divisions, will start getting more wins in champ. So yeah, it's been a real shift, a real change. I've felt it in my own games as well. And I'm still having high scoring games, but I've definitely felt my scores come down slowly over time, specifically in the goals I'm conceding, because you can't really gauge your opponent's ability. But in the goals I'm conceding, it's definitely on average coming down over time because I'm getting better at knowing when to switch, knowing when to intercept. Knowing that if I'm going to go for a bit of a lunging tackle, the player has to have anticipate and probably has to have anticipate plus to make that lunge to get the ball. So I just think there's a new skill set that people are having to go. And that does expose something like player switching, for example.
Just to add to that as well. So with ball relative, I'd actually recommend using it. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. People always say, oh, Neil, but no one else uses ball relative. And it's true. If I wasn't a creator and it wasn't my job to test these things, I will still be using player relative, but statistically speaking, it's the best right stick switching method. If you're asking me, previously I said, if you use player relative for over 2 years, it's no point changing because you're used to it. But if you're really struggling, I'd recommend ball relative because you can almost never make a mistake because you're moving your right analog stick, you're looking at the ball, and wherever the player is relative to the ball, so like if the player is below the ball, your right stick switch is going down. So your right stick is going down, you're always going to go to that player. So in those situations when there is a through ball or you're in that tight space and maybe an L1 switch can't give you the right player, that's where ball relative is favorable. Yes, it's true. On the very high pro level, there is a disadvantage that maybe when the ball is switched, you can't press in time. But to be honest, it's only affecting less than 1%, 0.5% of players. So I would say if you are really struggling, definitely give ball relative a go. It's not something that's going to change completely, but just maybe give it a go because for a lot of people, your eyes are naturally tracking where the ball is going across the pitch. So it's easier for you to switch. So initially, it might take you some time, some legwork to get used to it. In fact, you probably play worse. But I would say give it some time. You might notice a big difference and a big change in ball relative. I've not gone back to player relative since, to be honest.
That's fascinating, to be honest. I didn't realize you were, actively playing that consistently. I knew you tried it out, but yeah, that's cool. I've got a question for you, Neil, from a listener. I'll ask it, then we'll take a break, and then we'll hear your answer. So Burry says, Neil, in your previous defending videos, you said that defenders should jockey and focus on defending space instead of winning the ball. Post-patch, I'm seeing a lot of emphasis in the podcast supported Discord on anticipate defenders, suggesting that perhaps we should be more aggressive about tackling. What are your thoughts on going for tackles versus continuing to try to defend the space? So yeah, we'll get into that just after this break. Hello and welcome back after the break. So I mentioned that question before the break. I would just say, although there has been a lot of talk about anticipate in the Discord, I'm not sure that's necessarily because you want to be more aggressive. I think it's more that anticipate is quite relevant at the moment because we've had an Evo, which gives anticipate plus. It's also more effective after the patch. And I think it's pretty crucial actually because it stops the ball much better, I suppose. It prevents tacklebacks. And I've generally found that using a player without anticipate is a big mistake at this point, a defensive player. But going back to his question, Neil, he says, what are your thoughts on going for tackles versus continuing to try to defend the space?
If you focus just primarily on tackling versus defending the space, the key with defending, not only in real life, but also in FC and always has been defending the space and the angle towards goal. When you're defending, you got to think of your job to be like a wall. It's not your job to win the ball back. It's your job. Think of it like my opponent's going to shoot anyway. How can I reduce the probability of that shot going in? And normally, if you see most defensive mistakes, it's because people are trying to win the ball. Yes, I'm not saying don't win the ball, but I'm saying don't commit out of position. If you look at some of the top defenders in real life, 𝘱𝘀𝘀𝘀 van Dijk's one of my favorite. In 1v1 situations, he never commits. He runs back with the player, tries to force them on their weak foot in real life, and tries to defend the angle towards goal. You want that same approach, but you have to be somewhat aggressive. You can't be as passive as you was before. So when the ball goes to, for example, the winger, you got to switch it out to your right back early and maybe defend the space. But don't go forward because if you try to tackle, you can even get exploited much more than pre-patch because now through balls are deadly. And I think AI actually helps you almost over-assist the through ball. So you got to be very careful, and especially when players make those runs in behind. So there's a time and place when you can win the ball. I say go for it. Otherwise, I always say keep a structure and shape. It's better to not commit and then your opponent go through and get a guaranteed goal and at least push them away. Now, in terms of anticipate, I'm going to tell you something controversial. This is a NealGuides. This is what I would say, right? I think it's overrated. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a really good play style. I think you can win the ball back. That's guaranteed. But I think what people place as how good it is, I think is a bit overrated. For me, the best play style is a jockey play style. If you're struggling right now, get a jockey play style. I've always thought it's the best defending play style because the benefit of this is that, especially now, you're going to be slower with switching. You need that quick movement. The jockey playstyle, I promise you, if you're strong in defending, get someone like the rule breaker, 𝘬𝘃𝗲𝗏 card. Even better if you can still do that evolution with a jockey playstyle. It'll make a big, big difference to your defending. Everyone that I've told that to, they've changed their defending and it's improved them quite a bit.
Yeah, I tell you what, as someone who's currently evolving Maguire via that Jockey plus Evo, then into the centre back Evo, it is completely true that Jockey is super, super good, especially post patch. And I agree with you to some extent. I think Anticipate is a bit overrated. I would prefer, or the plus is overrated anyway. I would prefer to have a player with base Anticipate and Jockey plus than Anticipate plus and regular Jockey, actually. It kind of depends on the player a bit. Like, bigger players obviously benefit more from Jockey plus. So that's worth factoring in, or heavier players, I guess. But yeah, let's come to you, Josh. There's a few things covered there. Should we start off with the sort of defensive technique, I guess, or decision making? Anything to add based on what Neil said so far?
Yeah, like, just to pick up on the Anticipate thing, I think Anticipate is a good playstyle for making up for a bad tackle. If you tackle at an inopportune moment, Anticipate can sometimes help you to at least affect the ball carrier. Whereas if you tackle badly without Anticipate, they tend to like just tackle where they stand and kind of fall backwards a little bit and like just leave the space to go through. But Neil's absolutely right in the not committing. I think that's probably the big thing in the new patch is about, you have to put pressure on, you have to block the pass that you can see. But there's also that moment of, you need to wait for them to make a bad decision with the player on the ball, whether that's a sprint at the wrong time, a bad skill move, or a very obvious skill move. That's the point where you can dive in and go for it. And that becomes a skill, because they might be baiting you into trying to come in and go for the ball. You can also bait them into making a bad decision by pretending like you're going to press and then dropping back a little bit. The speed boost is something I think a lot of people talk about, but you can make people think they're going to get away with a speed boost and then be able to go and recover and get the ball. I definitely agree with Jockey, and actually just jockeying in general defensively. So many people I watch don't jockey defensively, and it blows my mind. Like, the ability to put yourself in a much better position to win the ball when you're jockeying and react quicker to a change of direction or to a pass is so much easier when you're in that kind of jockey stance. Like, and I don't know, I feel like their ability to block a pass or intercept a pass is highly improved as well when they're in that position. Don't be afraid to slide tackle, especially if you've got a player with the play style. If you're like struggling and if it's a bit of like a last ditch thing, slide tackles work a hell of a lot more than I think they necessarily should do. And so it's often something I think that's overlooked. I obviously don't like it as a playstyle plus, but as a base playstyle, if you know that your defender's got it, I'd definitely recommend leaning on it at times, or at least trying it out and seeing in what situations it can be effective, because it's very much more consistent at winning the ball, especially just like pushing it away from a defender or not allowing a defender to pick the ball up. I think there's a lot of different aspects. It's weird that I feel like to attack in the old patch, you needed patience in attack. Whereas now you can be quite like, let's just go forward quickly. I still think you need patience at the right moments. But I think the big difference in this patch is you need a lot of patience defensively, and you need to be able to time your pressure. I'll be honest, I've set my tactic up in 3 different ways. And those 3 different ways, there's a bit of role differentiation, but it's essentially how much pressure I want to try and put on my opponent when they're on the ball. Because I feel like that's probably like the biggest game changer in terms of like how you can shift the way a game is playing, is how deep your line is, and that that affects how much pressure you're able to put on. And then also a few of your roles, just in terms of where your players are positioned when the ball turns over. I've always been somebody who said if you can do it, if you've got quick enough wing backs and they're on wing back balanced, and your opponent's not somebody with their wingers on winger, if they've got them an inside forward, having your fullbacks on wing back balanced, especially if they're in plus, can help cut out a lot of the out balls that people lean on, the pinged passes out from midfield and defense that tend to go wide. So it's some of it is also about trying to learn through a game how your opponent's playing. I also think that plays a lot into, when people talk about scripting, I was 2-0 up and dominating, and then my opponent started like, I couldn't do anything in attack. And it's like, maybe the thing that you did that was working in the first half, your opponent learned how to defend it, because I definitely feel that in games. Like, each opponent's different. What they lean on, whether it's a They like to cut inside to finesse. They like to play a ball back with their striker to then play the through ball. Like, you have to start trying to play your opponent as much as you're playing the game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Are there any particular kind of details or tips you give people in terms of setting up tactically? Because that is something that I wanted to move on to.
It's difficult for me to give that because the thing that everybody uses, I absolutely despise. I can't play 4-2-1-3 at all. I hate it. I think it's terrible for build-up. I think it sits way too deep. I can't put enough pressure on with it. Like, it's not my style at all. Like, I'm playing 4-4-1-1 at the moment. Having at least one midfielder on I see a lot of people set up with it on holding ++ on one midfielder, and that's absolutely fine. I like box-to-box ++ on one of them and then a playmaker on the other one. I just prefer the way they work in attack, and I prefer to lean on my attack. I'm also much more comfortable at slowing down counterattacks, and so I don't feel like I need as much protection in the middle of the pitch in those defensive midfield spots as others may do, because when I lose the ball and the ball turns over, I'm good at slowing somebody down so that my team does fall back enough that I can drag a midfielder in, that I can, mark properly with my players. I like wide mids instead of wingers as well for an attacking reason. So yeah, I think role ++ is something I would look at, especially if you're struggling defensively. Like, if you can get, I would much sooner have a player on ball playing defender ++ than defender plus, for example. So like, that would be something I would just look at in terms of your setup. You can then tailor your tactics to your personnel to an extent. Yeah, everyone sets up on fullback defend, and I hate it. I don't like fullback defend either. Like, I feel like I need to use them for something that isn't defending. Otherwise, like, I'm just playing Pep Guardiola and having 4 centre backs in my back line. So yeah, I don't know. Tactically, I set up with, I've got both my centre backs have got defender ++, so I have them on there. I tend to start a game in wing-back balanced because both of my fullbacks have wing-back ++. Both my wingers run inside forward, or wide mids run inside forward. I have box-to-box and playmaker in the middle. Shadow striker at cam, which I just think is the best role in the game, especially with the ++, and advanced forward as a striker. So that's like how I'm setting up. I start at 70 depth. I have a 96 depth option, and I have a 49 depth option. Kind of arbitrary numbers, just like where I've set them, and we'll use them depending on how I feel the game is playing out.
Yeah, it's important to say you can duplicate tactics in the team management menu, so it's really not too tricky to set up a tactic which has slight tweaks, and it's definitely recommended, and then you can shift via the D-pad contextually. Neil, let's come to you. In terms of tactics, is there anything particularly, I know it's somewhat personal depending on players and the way people want to play, but any particular pointers you have defensively in terms of how to set up?
I always look at it like, imagine you're driving your car and you have like a partner. You might have different seat positions. And what I'm trying to say is you have to make the adjustments depending on yourself, right? So I personally think defend is the best. But let's say, for example, you're an aggressive defender. And let's say, for example, you're not someone that runs out, you're an aggressive defender and you have possession most of the time and you like to hold the ball like 70% of the time. If you use defend, it might not be for you. So what I'd always say is go with a passive setup first and then make the adjustment to be more attacking. Because then you have a good baseline. And then, for example, you can try, let's say you have two CDMs, or let's say 2 center mids to make things easy. You have one of them on holding and you have one of them, for example, on box to box. If you find that's too, okay, you know what, I'm okay with defending like this, then maybe put one of them to a playmaker, or put, as I said previously, put one of them to box and one of them to playmaker. The key thing is adjusting it for yourself. If you're really not too sure, what Ben said as well is also important. Let's say you play one formation, okay? Create 4 different variations of the same formation. So let's just say 4-2-1-3 as an example. So what I would have, for example, is a 4-2-1-3, maybe with a left back, right back on defend, both CDMs on holding, and maybe inside forward on left wing and right wing, and then the cam on playmaker, and maybe a depth of, let's say, 35 or 40. Then I have another one, the same thing, but maybe, for example, on this one, I might have maybe one of my CDMs on deep line playmaker. Maybe I might put, for example, one of my fullbacks on balanced. And then for the attacking one, I may have, for example, 75 depth. And I might have, for example, I don't know, the cam on Shadow Striker, the striker, the advance forward, and maybe the left wing and right wing. So in my opinion, inside forward roaming is one of my favorite play styles. That and the Shadow Striker, both of those. But that way you have a progressive setup. So when you're inside the game, you can change it because, as was said before, your opponent can adapt to you. You know, if you're winning 2-0 in the first half, especially now when you can't really hold a 2-0 win unless you really hold possession quite a bit, it's quite difficult. So your opponent's going to figure out, okay, I know what this player is doing, and they're going to adapt to you. So you should be adapting to them as they are to you. So if, for example, they're committing more players going forward, you might want to think, okay, you know what? I've got to think twice about keeping my right wing and left wing on inside forward roaming where they're basically staying forward. Maybe I should put them on balance where they come back a little bit. So these are all the things. So if you're really not too sure, whatever formation you're using right now, just create 4 different variations, make one defensive, one more middle tier, and then one maybe more attacking where you can apply a bit more pressure where they sit higher up. And that's what I'd recommend as a good baseline if you're really not too sure.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, on this sort of topic, we had this question from Matt MS saying, should we be more aggressive post-patch, pushing players forward and just try and score as many as possible to take advantage of the open defenses rather than, I guess, sitting back and conceding because it's quite hard to defend? I mean, I guess that's going to be kind of dealer's choice, Neil. It's going to be up to the player themselves. But would you say if you're someone who likes to be aggressive, it's a good idea to just go for it now and not worry so much as people maybe did before that they were going to get exposed?
So I think one thing that's important is I know defenses have opened up, but I think it's actually harder to be aggressive. Now, when I say that, it's kind of 2 different ways. When I mean that, I'm talking about running out with centre backs. So if you're running out with your centre backs, look, even myself, I'm a very aggressive defender. Yes, I know I teach one way, but when I'm playing myself, I'm a very aggressive defender. Once you get to that level where you understand defending, you can play aggressive. But if you're running out aimlessly with your centre backs, you're going to concede. So what the first thing I want to say straight away is, when I'm talking about aggressive, I'm not talking about running out with your centre backs aimlessly, trying to get the ball or trying to be frustrated, because without a shadow of a doubt, especially post-patch, one simple through ball in behind will completely wipe out your entire defense. You could have 99 sprint speed. I got Van de Ven. I got some of the best centre backs. I've even tried that Maldini card, right? When you get beaten with a through ball, you're not catching up. So that's the first thing. What you can be is maybe with your centre mids, you can try to be a bit more aggressive and trying to close the passing lanes out. Maybe, for example, if your opponent is, for example, switching the ball from side to side, you could, for example, switch to your right mid early and then try to apply pressure. Applying pressure then being aggressive in those situations is fine. But being aggressive with your defensive line, I think it's too risky. You will know yourself. The best thing to do is watch your gameplay back. Ask yourself, am I good enough? And this is the most important thing. Am I good enough to run out? To be honest, 99% of the time, even you run out with the centre back and you do the right thing, you're going to get penalised. In my opinion, you keep your back 4 in shape, let them defend. Your left back rabbit, you can get away with it a little bit. And if you want to be aggressive, I'd rather you be aggressive higher up the pitch. That way, at least you still got some place to recover.
Yeah.
Ideally, and one thing I would say is, one trick I always tell everyone, if you're defending, let's say, I know we like the 4-2-3-1, but let's say any of those 4-2-3-1s, 4-2-1-3s, which everyone is using. We all hate it, but it's so effective. But if you do be aggressive with one CDM, then run back with the other one. So if you know, okay, the ball's in the middle of the pitch, my CDM is near, I'm going to make a decision and be aggressive. Then with the other player, you should be thinking, I need to run back straight away. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to run back. So at least that way, you can run forward one player, take the risk, and then run back. The last thing you want to do is run forward with 2 CDMs or centre mids, have no one between your defensive line and your midfield. And I think if your opponent's got a 4v4 with your defensive line, even a 3 versus 4, with the new movement and how defense is, you could be very much in trouble with how the tracking is. So you're probably going to concede. So that's what I would say. So be maybe aggressive with the attacking players, not with your defensive players. In my opinion, it's better to be passive, but when there is a good chance of you winning the ball or making a tackle, of course, go for it.
Let's take a break there. And I know there's some stuff that Neil wants to cover on passing, so we'll do that right after this break. Hello, listeners. A big announcement. There's a 36,000 FC point giveaway going on the Patreon right now. So if you'd considered supporting before, but perhaps hadn't, it's a great time to join up because there are really good odds of winning that. It's just £3 a month to support, and you do get an extra podcast every single week as I say. And at the gold or icon tiers, there's access to the Discord too, where there's loads of great resources and a fantastic community. So if you're interested in any of that, then you can just head over and search Support FUT Weekly or follow the link in the description of this podcast. A huge thank you if you do consider doing so, because it really helps the podcast out and it keeps FUT Weekly weekly, in fact, twice weekly for supporters. Right, let's jump back into this week's podcast. Hello, welcome back after the break again. Right, let us dig into talking about passing actually, because although there are lanes opening up more than ever, and perhaps it's a bit easier than it was before the patch. I remember before the patch saying that you're starting to need tiki-taka and pinged pass playstyles to actually play harder passes. That isn't the case anymore, but obviously those playstyles are still important. And we had a few people wondering about, how can I take advantage of my opponent's defensive mistakes through passing? So I thought that'd be a good thing to bring to you, Neil. Have you got any tips on passing post-patch?
To be honest, I think with the passing changes, you don't need the playstyles, but I do feel they have maybe high, especially the tiki-taka playstyle. I think if you're the kind of player that likes running down the wing, rotating the ball back inside the box, I think that's where the tiki-taka playstyle can really, really help. Because if you're, for example, in a box, and let's say you're up against someone who knows how to defend, that first time quick pass can be the difference between you taking a shot and your opponent switching to the defender in time and recovering. So that's why I think those playstyles have the unique ability to really help you after the patch. I think with like ping passing as well, I like it because when you have the ball with your center mids, especially with your CDMs, to move the ball forward to a striker and then doing, for example, a skill move or something like that can be very, very effective as well. But the key with passing is timing. You need to know, like, even when you're doing a through ball, I know after the patch, the game assists you a bit with the through ball, maybe over assists you can argue, but it's all about timing. Let's say you trigger a run and the player's making a run. You have to look at when the player is just about to be offside and then make the pass. So like everything, you have to be facing the player. Well, maybe you can get away with maybe not face the player as much now, but it's all about timing. Your timing has to be perfect. If your timing is incorrect, it could be a difference between your pass getting through and then not getting through. So even if, for example, you have a player that's got, let's say, for some reason, that's a cam or winger, God knows what, for like 80 sprint speed, let's say. But if your timing is good, you're still going to get the ball, if that makes sense. Maybe your opponent may catch up to you because you've got lower sprint speed, but the timing is the most important thing. That's what I wanted to mention. So the difference between like a pro player and a casual player is not doing those special passes, they're just timing the pass.
That's a really good point. And I think there is maybe a bit of a tendency to focus on the power of the pass and the direction that you're pointing, which is still somewhat important. Whereas actually, as you say, the timing of the pass, and also actually, I guess, Josh, maybe the position you put yourself in to make the pass, being in a comfortable position to play a pass in that direction, those things are going to make a big difference to the pass quality.
Yeah, and there are lots of factors that you need to try and take into account. Is this the first touch the player's taken? Is this going to be a first time pass? And if it is, what was the kind of pass that they received beforehand? Is the ball bouncing? Do they have it fully under control? Is it on their strong foot? Have you positioned them in a way that they can potentially bend a ball around a player? There are a bunch of different factors that the timing thing is such a big part of it. And actually, some of that timing thing is muscle memory rather than necessarily in the moment going, and now I'm going to pass it. Some of it's actually, I know the length of time it takes, A, for my animation of passing to hit, but B, how long it will take my player to be offside. And so therefore, when I need to play the pass, when we talk about passing around the edge of the box, that pass played into a striker, the fired pass on the edge of the box into a striker, knowing the timing of that pass, watching for the run of the player, are they peeling off the defender so that actually you can play it to them and they're going to body away a fullback rather than having to deal with the centre back? There are lots of different factors with passing. Knowing your players' passing play styles, even their base ones, is super, super important. Not as important it was before, but certainly important. With through balls, incisive through balls do still look different to bog standard through balls, even though they have been helped. Especially if you're someone who likes to put a bit of swerve on it, like I do, then you do need that playstyle plus to really make or play style to make the most of them. There is a pass type that is something I'm still testing out. Like, I'm not saying this is gonna win you more games, but it's something I don't really see anybody using. And then I played somebody last week who was absolutely incredible with it. And it's an L1R1 square. So it's like a driven, lofted pass. And they were quite in vogue for a while, maybe like 2 years ago. But I've not really seen anybody use them since. And they were being played in multiple situations. So the first situation that I've been now testing it out and was played against me is to a winger, especially to a winger that's beginning to make a run, because I think the trajectory of the ball, it can like freeze the defender, especially if the player's got long pass just as a base play style. If they've got long pass plus, it's even better, but just base long pass is good enough. It can like freeze the defender underneath the ball. And also, because you're not really expecting it as a pass, when you get auto switched, especially if someone's being auto switched, they can get pulled out of position because they're not thinking about where they need to run to protect from this weird pass type that you've not seen before. So from kind of deep up to a winger, it's really good. Crossfield is where it is absolutely elite. Now, there are times when it will get intercepted because it rarely gets above head height. But what that also means is it draws players in between the pitch, between the passer of the ball and the person receiving the ball. They think they can get a play on it, and so they kind of move out. They're in the wrong position, and now suddenly they have to get back in position. And if you've now got the ball on the opposite wing, there's going to be more spaces opened up. If you think you've got a chip through ball from one side of the pitch to the other side of the pitch to your winger who's kind of got a bit of space, maybe you've caught a fullback further up the pitch, I find the chip through balls, especially because you're usually passing it with a forward who doesn't have long ball, who doesn't have incisive maybe, that pass can be really high and loopy and not too far ahead of them that actually you get the advantage of playing the pass. If you play the L1R1 square, the ball gets them much quicker, so you can take advantage of that space. And they very often will play it with a bit of curve to play it ahead of the player so that they can then take it down. And with a kind of prevalence of everyone's using that Zidane, who's got acrobatic plus, because the ball's low but in the air, anything you do from that point that is either passing it or shooting it is most likely going to make use of that playstyle plus, because any bouncing ball triggers acrobatic. It's not just for acrobatic things. It's just a volley playstyle plus essentially. So there's loads of different aspects where I think it's a useful pass. It's something I'm still testing out. It's not something I go on in a very tight game because I'm not like good enough with it yet that I feel confident enough that it's better than what another option I could do. But definitely in certain games, especially with some setups with the way your opponent's playing, and definitely that pass that should usually be played with a chip through ball, but where your winger's in a lot of space, I'm playing it a lot then, and I'm getting a lot of joy out of it. So yeah, it's just an extra thing that you could potentially add to your arsenal, even if it's just to confuse your opponent for a couple of passes, and then you never really go back to it. It's something that will then be in their head that they might have to defend.
Yeah, you mentioned that to me, and I've tried it quite a few times since then, and yeah, I agree. It is very useful, especially I think there are situations where you can find your winger where there isn't really another pass that is going to put them in the same position once they get the ball, that lobbed pass will put them in, if that makes sense. So I definitely think it's worth experimenting with. So the final question I have is about the goalkeeper rushing out. We mentioned it in the context of it being a good thing to do because it can catch your opponent out, especially if they have the rush out playstyle or playstyle plus. But it's fair to say that it can be a bit of a nuisance when people do it against you. And I think it'd be good to talk about what we do in those situations, especially when it's a rush out plus goalkeeper. They do come out very quickly. So, Neil, let's start with you. What would you recommend people do in that situation where they're trying to beat the keeper?
to be honest, if you're up against a good player and they time it well, like let's say you have a well-drilled defense, they know the exact time to do it. It's very difficult to get past, because the way people bring up the goalkeeper, especially on top level, is when you take that touch, they bring the goalkeeper out. So it's enough to close the gap. So if you do take a shot, the goalkeeper is going to parry or deflect it away. What you can do, it depends on your level. So a higher level, I would say you could even go with something like a 𝘵𝘀 and a shot cancel. I kind of do that. I try to get like an animation glitch. But to be honest, I think one of the best things you can do is just pass the ball away. That is why I like the tiki-taka playstyle. I know it's more for first touch, but this is where these play styles, I think, they come in. If I'm inside the box, let's say, and something is rushing, a goalkeeper's rushing towards me, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to pass the ball away, at least to someone else. Because when a goalkeeper rushes out, I feel like they're just overpowered. They always make the save, so I don't take the shot. I think that's one of the big issues. So if I'm inside the box, I'm passing. Let's say if I'm the goalkeeper, let's say I'm running towards the box and maybe there's a defender next to me, but I'm kind of got away and the goalkeeper's rushing out, then what I normally do is I go for a chip shot there. That's the way that I do it. Maybe not the most effective ways. I mean, like I should probably do a bit more of like the shot cancel one. But I would say maybe old habits die hard in this situation. I sometimes also do a fake shot around the goalkeeper, but it isn't as effective as it once was, but it's something I just like doing. So maybe it's not one that I recommend, but one that I probably overuse too much because I just naturally do it. I've been doing it for like the past, 10, 15 years. So it's just out of habit, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear that, because I think my tendency has been in past cycles to, ball roll the keeper, heel to heel ball roll around the keeper, that sort of thing. And I think I should probably do that a bit more. But when you get surprised by the keeper, I find my reflex is to do a chip shot, which can sometimes work. But I do think it actually highlights the importance of the regular chip shot playstyle, because that does seem to make it much more consistent. And yeah, I was interested to know from you, Josh, what you're tending to do when you are faced with a sudden keeper rush out.
So I think it's situational, as most things are when we talk about them. I am a big fan of the chip. In fact, if I play my player through like straight down the middle of the pitch, I'm almost hovering over to chip. Like I'm ready to, if I see that keeper begin to come, I'm ready to chip, because if you can get the chip shot off while the keeper's got forward momentum, like you don't need to be super precise with the power. And on precision, I've got the direction like fine. That's not an issue either. And I think they're incredibly effective this year. But there are certain situations, especially if I'm running kind of sideways across the box, and if you're running at an angle, not towards the goal but away from goal, if they start charging the keeper runs out at a bizarre angle. They tend to run out too far over to their near post, and so just a like slight tap, like a low driven shot to the far side of the goal, the keepers just are too far away and they do not react to that, like the ball being able to go there. But there is situations where you get surprised by a keeper charge, especially in situations where you're maybe not through, but you're in a situation where you could maybe take a shot and the keeper's coming at you. And that's where I would absolutely go with Neil. Pass the ball. Players tend to stop focusing on what they're doing defensively once they keeper charge, because they're just now looking at the keeper charging, right? You have to hold a button for it to happen. And so the direction and what you're doing with your other player is you're probably not concentrating on your defender. And so if you can pass the ball, they then have that moment of, oh shit, like what do I need to do here? Who do I switch to? Like they can have those real kind of panic moments defensively. And I do feel like when the goal is open, it's like in previous cycles, I feel like when the goal's been open, your players almost have more of a propensity to miss because they're trying to aim for the corner rather than the middle of the goal. And I don't feel like that happens this year. So it's definitely, pulling back and passing the ball to somebody that maybe doesn't feel like they're in a much better position, but actually are in a better position can be much more consistent. I tend not to try and dribble around the keeper as much, but that's mainly because it's been like coaxed out of me over a period of almost 18 months where, you couldn't really do it consistently. Chip is the thing I lean on most heavily.
Yeah, actually, I just thought one thing I don't think we have mentioned is technical dribble. Obviously, that is a way of dribbling in a controlled but relatively fast way. And I've found that can be quite helpful for beating the keeper if the player has technical plus, or they're just, I guess, fast enough to get away from a rush out plus keeper. You'll get used to it after doing it with certain players and being able to then gauge the speed at which the player's going to go and, you know, what angles to take. But you essentially slightly technical dribble towards the keeper, and then you technical dribble to the right or left, to the side, a relatively harsh angle, and it should mean you just go past the keeper. It's also quite useful because if you're sprinting in a goal, it's a way of sort of moderating your speed as you get closer without, you know, really slowing down to a dribble. You still get a bit more pace, and I found that quite helpful. And for those who don't know, technical dribble is just hold R1 on PlayStation or hold RB on Xbox. Actually, saying the Xbox controls just reminded me, I don't think we said what the Xbox controls would be for the pass you mentioned earlier, Josh, so we should get that in.
Yeah, it's the shoulder buttons, the bumper buttons on Xbox, and whatever button you use to long pass, whether that be, is it X? And unless you're a psychopath and use the right button on your thing.
I mean, yeah, who would be playing 𝘵𝘬𝗍? Couldn't be you.
No.
That's for sure. Anyway, I think that does maybe wrap up how we'd approach beating the keeper when they rush out. And I think we're pretty much ready to wrap up there, unless you have any final points, Neil, you wanted to sneak in that the listeners might find helpful.
Jockey playstyle will save your defense. Remember this.
A very good point, yeah. I did realize I had Jockey Plus on all 4 of my defenders at one point recently, and yeah, it was joyous. It's definitely something I'd recommend. And it's also really good in defensive midfield for sure as well.
That's, I would say, the centre backs and the CDMs, especially with CDMs, because you can track back with them. And then that way, remember, if you're bad at defending as it is, if you're late to switching, the Jockey playstyle can help you get away with it as well. So give you that momentum almost to not momentum. I mean, be careful what words I use here, but give you give you the ability to quickly recover with a Jockey playstyle. Kind of get away with otherwise a mistake that you would have done. So
yeah, actually, it reminded me, I wanted to read the description of the Playstyle Plus, particularly for Jockey. It says increased max speed of sprint jockey and greatly improves transition speed from jockey to sprint. And I think it's that improvement in the transition speed from jockey to sprint that really helps in the current meta. If a defender is, you know, accelerating away from you in a channel, then it allows you to go out of the jockey and start sprinting kind of the maximum possible speed that would be possible, I guess, out of that jockey and into the sprint. So I think it's a really important thing to highlight. Great. Well, I think that does wrap us up. Before we actually do our goodbyes, I did want to mention that there is currently a 36,000 FC point giveaway going on Patreon at the moment. So if you've been considering supporting, hadn't done so yet, then it's a great time to support. Just search Support FUT Weekly, head over and sign up, and you'll get double the podcast content. And of course, if you are a supporter, don't forget to enter that supporter giveaway. Right, let's say our goodbyes. So Neil, it's been great to have you on, and we obviously recommend people check out all your guide content on YouTube.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's always good to be back on the podcast, and you can always find me on youtube.com/NealGuides or my FC school, FC25 school. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys soon.
Certainly good to have you on, and look forward to having you on again soon. And as always, Josh, great to have you along for this gameplay episode.
Yeah, it's been good to be here. I got one final thing for those precision shooting truthers. If you're somebody who enjoyed the first time Power Shot Plus meta and, you know, didn't enjoy the fact that you can't really do it as much now, first time precision shooting, just normal shooting, it's pretty effective. Like if you're getting the ball rolling across on the edge of the box, if you can do it first time on precision, you get a fairly similar animation to what you would get before. So give it a shot.
Very nice. Good bit of advice. And yeah, that does wrap us up. As I said, do enter that supporter giveaway and sign up as a supporter. If you fancy it, you get an extra podcast, of course, every single week. If you're catching this podcast on YouTube, then do drop a like, leave a comment. It may well get read out on the podcast and it helps out in the algorithm. And also do drop a subscription, of course. You can subscribe on YouTube or any other podcast platforms too. Thank you very much to all those supporters for keeping the podcast going. And of course, to those icon patrons. Dave B, Hugh J, Jeff B, Darren W, Warren A, Stephen M, Waterman, Dan W, Roger D, Rob P, Lee A, Dom P, L M, Damon H, The Shirt Locker, Alex M, Tom B, Jake S, Neil P, Michael K, David G, Andrew R, Michael H, Jimmy K, Brendan T, 𝘵𝘀𝘀𝘁, Michael B, Brian V, Josh R, Brent P, Rob W, and Juicy. Plus a special thanks to Luke M, Dave B, Hugh J, Tom M, Darren W, and Pato Foot for advice and production assistance. Before I leave you, just one more thing to add though. Ultimate Team is a bit like life really. It has its many ups and downs. If you're having a few more downs than ups in real life in these more difficult times, then please don't feel that you're alone or need to struggle on without taking action. If you go to thecalmzone.net, there's loads of resources, advice, support, or even just a friendly chat for anyone who needs it. If it sounds like it could help you, then head over to thecalmzone.net. And for now, have a good one, and I'll catch you on the next podcast.